Let's get started. My name is Suri Moon. I'm co-director of the Global Health Center here at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar on transparency and access to medicines 1 year after the WHA resolution. Of course, in a more normal year, we would have been in the middle of the World Health Assembly week. Here at the center, this is one of the biggest and busiest times of the year for us, and we have decided to continue with our series of events even with the Health Assembly having taken place virtually just a couple of days ago. This year, for the first time, we had an open call for proposals for events that different organizations wish to organize in conjunction with us. And one of the proposals that was selected through a competitive process was the one that was put forward by our co-organizers today, the Observatoire de la transparence dans les politiques du médicament, or OTMeds, as I will call it. So I'd really like to thank our partners at OTMeds for the strong collaboration in putting together this event today. I especially want to thank our Swiss and French teams. Today is a public holiday here in Geneva and in France, and people are working very hard despite that. This topic is clearly an issue that is of high interest. It remains very relevant and of great interest to people around the world. We've had hundreds of registrations for this webinar, including participants from governments, from intergovernmental organizations, global health initiatives, academia, industry, civil society, and the media. So welcome to everyone. I look forward to engaging in discussions with all of you. And for the last 20 or 30 minutes of the webinar, we will have time for Q&A. Please do feel free to enter your questions and comments in the Q&A box as we go along. I'll now give the floor over to Pauline Landé, who is our co-organizer. She is the co-founder of OTMeds. She is an advocate, a researcher, a writer, and a filmmaker who has worked for many years to improve global access to both diagnostics and medicines for a wide range of conditions, including HIV, hepatitis C, TB, diabetes, etc. And she serves on a number of advisory and community boards for different public health organizations. So Pauline will begin with an introduction to the topic today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shori. Thank you, everybody, for joining this event. So I would like to thank also our media partner, Mediapart and Health Policy Watch. So as Shuri said, on May 28 in 2019, a milestone resolution on improving the transparency of markets for medicines, vaccines, and other health products was adopted by the WHO member states. In June 2019, with my friend Jérôme Martin, we decided to launch an observatory to watch the implementation of the resolution in France. The adoption of the resolution was not an easy process, and we thought that we wanted to seize the momentum and the opportunity of all the mobilization to push for the French government to implement it. Until now, the main activities that we have conducted have been to first develop a transparency checklist divided in 8 topics to provide governments with concrete examples of how transparency could be implemented, for instance, through decrees, but not only. Between September and December last year, we proposed amendments to members of the parliament to include transparency in the social security budget bill. One of them, co-written by Caroline Fiat, who's one of our panelists today, on transparency in public funding for R&D, was adopted by the parliament before being censored by the Constitutional Court. But why have we been fighting so much on the transparency topic? Why is it so important? Transparency is not an end in itself, it's a means to address critical issues. For more than 1 year in France, health workers have been on strike, denouncing austerity measures that have been day after day destroying our public health system, our public hospitals. Budget cuts are every day made on critical equipment and staff. But at the same time, the prices of new medicines have been exploding and never challenged. The last example, a gene therapy marketed by Novartis for €2 million per treatment. Transparency appears critical to us to guide policies in health and guide the choices made by governments, including financial choices and budget orientation. Because this is the opacity in research and development spending and prices setting of medicine that has allowed a treatment discovered through the public research of INSERM and then developed thanks to caritative funding to be sold to the public sector, 2 million euros. The public sector has already funded its development, including through tax credits, but we would have to pay it again through the reimbursement of the public health system. Opacity in the patent system has, for example, allowed a company like Sanofi to grant patents on a combination of 2 tuberculosis drugs known for decades that Sanofi did not discover itself, granting Sanofi, so these patents granting Sanofi a monopoly on this combo until 2034, including in countries with high tuberculosis burden, such as Nigeria or South Africa. More generally, opacity in the patent system has contributed to the practice of evergreening. Opacity has also allowed 3 drug companies, Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo, to patent new formulations of insulin, a drug known for a century, with the result of preventing the access to this drug for the people around the world. How is it possible that in a rich country like the United States, people die in 2020 because they can't afford insulin? Opacity in the R&D, in the funding of R&D has also allowed, as another example, a drug company like Janssen to market at a very high price a drug, bedaquiline, the last breakthrough against multi-resistant tuberculosis, while its R&D was at least at 60% funded by public and non-profit organizations. Opacity in the contracts signed between governments and diagnostic companies, that has, as a result, so much concentrated the sector of diagnostics that when a crisis like COVID-19 hits, the French government doesn't even know which PCR platforms are being used in the country and where the reagents are being produced. In the COVID-19 crisis in France on diagnostics, these are the open platforms that have saved us, allowing us to perform these COVID-19 tests, while the leaders of the market sector of diagnostics, Roche, Abbott, and bioMérieux, were still in the process of developing their tests as they became interested in developing these tests only when the pandemic hit. Opacity, finally, in the supply chain and in the production chain of active pharmaceutical ingredients and raw materials of medicines, completely left to the control of multinational and private sector, and which conducted to the shortages of critical drugs used in intensive care and palliative care units, such as curars and painkillers. The consequence of the opacity in the production and supply chain, some critical drugs were removed from protocols in public hospitals in France this month and replaced by suboptimal options. This is not acceptable that a country who considers itself as a leader of the pharmaceutical sector postpones urgent surgery of people because key drugs such as curars are missing. And this is again the lack of transparency that has prevented the French government to take concrete actions at the peak of COVID-19. It took 1.5 months to the government to finally take the decision to identify active pharmaceutical ingredient suppliers and to directly buy from the raw material from them and to transform them in plants in France. More transparency would have highlighted long ago that the drugs and test shortages are not only due to exceptional circumstances, but are the consequences of a structural problem where health products are considered as products like any others, as with consequence, people not being able to access to life-saving drugs and public health systems being so weakened that performing basic healthcare is not possible in case of a pandemic, even in the wealthiest countries. This is why transparency is so critical. It's about ensuring the sustainability of public health system in France. For instance, it's about being able to adapt the public policies in health when a crisis like COVID-19 hits, and it's about ensuring the access to life-saving medicines for all people who need them around the world. I would like to conclude by quoting Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, who's the Nobel Prize of Medicine 2008, and who said, "What is the point of scientific research and of therapeutic innovation if the people who need them can't access them?" Thank you for this, for listening to this introduction, and I now give the floor again to Suri.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for laying out the background and the context within which we are convening today. I'm really delighted that we have with us the two co-chairs, actually, of the WHA resolution negotiations last year. And kicking off our discussions today will be Dr. Leni Aswenda. She's the founder and CEO of Medicines for Africa, which is an organization that works to improve access to affordable medicines. As I mentioned, she was one of the co-chairs on behalf of the delegation of Zimbabwe. She's also an immunologist who has conducted vaccine research that really has quite a broad and multi-factorial perspective on these questions. So Dr. Wenda, let me turn first to you and ask you to remind us of what was this WHA resolution. I think Pauline really laid out a number of the problems that were facing governments a year ago, and a number of the new problems that have really come to the fore in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. What did the resolution say? Why did the resolution matter? What were some of the big areas of disagreement or tension between member states? And how did this process finally end up, how did member states come to reach consensus and agreement on the resolution? Over to you.
Thank you, Suri. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really demonstrated one of the fundamental facts that the success of any health system depends on the availability of quality essential medical products. And that means diagnostics, pharmaceuticals, devices, all the technologies that we need to diagnose, to treat, to prevent, rehabilitate, and provide care to patients. And when patients aren't able to access these products, it undermines their performance and quality of national disease responses and interventions. And it causes tremendous suffering, disability, and reduces quality of life for millions of people around the world. And it impacts livelihoods, trapping many people in vicious cycle of poverty. Now, I think thanks to COVID-19, we all now have a very clear understanding why access to medical products is so critical and key to advancing universal health coverage. But unfortunately, for many health systems globally, they are under pressure from rising healthcare costs, like Pauline just outlined. And this is limiting the ability of governments to provide quality care to patients. And every country is affected by the rising costs of medical products. And so, and this is one of the reasons why we needed this resolution. Now, pharmaceutical companies or companies that are making these medical products generally would defend the need for high prices by highlighting the huge R&D costs, investments, including the conduct of clinical trials to justify why they have to charge or why their profits far exceeds the investments that are made in product development. So the primary purpose of the resolution was to bring greater transparency on what it costs to develop health products and how that cost is reflected in the prices of products through the public sharing of information and the actual prices that governments and other buyers are paying for these products. And so it required that companies would disclose as much information as possible on their investment throughout the entire value chain of product development, including clinical trials, the pricing, the discounting arrangements, the patents, and any other factors that influence pricing along the value chain from the laboratory to the patient. The resolution gave the WHO the mandate to support government efforts to improve transparency, to monitor the impact of transparency on affordability of medical products and their availability, including how it affects the idea of differential pricing, where countries pay according to their income level. And why does all of this matter? It matters. Transparency matters because, firstly, it's a common pillar for good governance, for development. Since R&D health product of health products is often funded through both public and private resources, transparency, having transparency of what was invested along the entire value chain helps to ensure that the pricing of those products is fair. And the discussions that Pauline just highlighted on that the French government is having with Sanofi is a critical case in point regarding access to COVID-19 vaccine. And so transparency helps governments to make informed decisions when buying health products, enabling them to negotiate more affordable prices in order to be able to expand access to health products by populations. So many governments are overburdened and struggling to control the rising cost of healthcare, and in some cases having to ration treatment, and in other cases treatments aren't available at all. And greater transparency on the cost of R&D and the production, the cost of production of medical products would facilitate the effective negotiation of more affordable prices. And so enabling governments to create national policies that facilitate the greatest number of people being able to access the treatment when they need it. It's really critical. What did this resolution say? Basically, it highlighted the concern that the rising prices for health products is really contributing to the inequitable access within and amongst member states, causing financial hardship for many people and impeding progress towards universal health coverage. It also highlights the types of data that are or that need to be publicly available across the value chain of development of health products and their production, including prices that are effectively paid by different actors, the costs, and how they vary amongst countries, and making sure that information can be comparable between countries, between buyers, to facilitate efforts to improve access by patients. So the resolution seeks to progressively improve the public availability of information on the financial inputs, the investment that is made during development and production of medical products, making sure that it's publicly available, what are the relevant patents, what is the status of those patents, and the entire landscape covering a particular health product, of course, in order to get a clear understanding even of the marketing approval status of a product. And so what were some of the major issues that we encountered in negotiating this resolution with Director General Libasi, with whom I was chairing these negotiations? First of all, there was the complexity of issues of access. How to capture the original text of the resolution, pushed for prices, for clinical trial data, R&D cost to be made public. But there were many challenges in gaining enough support for including clinical trial data, R&D data, in terms of the reporting requirements. And some argued that a single focus on simply the cost of these items does not capture effectively the complexity of access issues. And we had different difficult conversations around this and why those things were necessary. The second area of tension was the kind of data that needs to be shared, that needs to be captured, and whether that would be feasible. It would be feasible to collect such extensive data, and how that would be governed and managed across countries with different national legislative framework. and you know, being able to do that in a way that allows countries to be able to work with that information in order to facilitate access at a national level. Then there was the concern about the unintended effects of transparency on the idea of differential pricing, which is applied by the pharmaceutical industry, which allows countries or buyers within different with different abilities to pay according to their income category. Now, the pharmaceutical companies were highlighting the risk that the increase in transparency would lead to price convergence and prevent differential pricing, which favors low and middle income countries. And for low and middle income countries, the concern was whether price transparency would also create the risk that high income countries would begin to demand prices, similar prices to what low and middle income countries normally pay, and that a supplier may actually be in a position to choose to stop applying differential pricing, which would lead to the cost being unaffordable for low and middle income countries and affect access within low and middle income countries. And of course, there were other tensions, other challenges within these negotiations that were not technical in their nature, that were related to the process, the time that member states had to come to a resolution. And so quite a lot of challenges. And perhaps I could stop here before going into how we dealt with those challenges and come back to that later after other speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Huenda, for that very clear overview of both the contents of the resolution, what some of the controversial areas were. And I think we will now turn over to Dr. Luca Libasci, who is the former head of the Italian Medicines Agency. He's a medical doctor by training with a long history of having worked, a long career, I should say, of having worked both at national and international levels for a number of different organizations on medicines policy. As mentioned earlier, he was the co-chair together with Dr. Huenda of the negotiations, and he has also been directly involved with implementation of the resolution at national level in Italy. So I understand that the connection may be going in and out. We'll do our best to capture as much wisdom from you, Dr. Libasci, as we can. So let me begin asking a follow-up question. You know, this resolution was first tabled, in fact, by your government. What was the main motivation behind doing this? Ultimately, the range of countries that co-sponsored the resolution was quite broad, both in terms of geographic representation as well as the level of development. What do you make of that? And would you like to add any further comments on Dr. Huenda's explanation to us of what happened at last year's WHA? Over to you.
Thank you, Suri, and good day, everybody. And thank you for organizing this webinar. I think the issue, as we can see, the issues are still very relevant, even in the current context of the pandemic. And actually, let me say that, to be honest, the issues that were raised with the proposal to discuss the resolution last year at WHA were not new issues. I mean, everyone working in access to pharmaceuticals have always recognized the need to have more transparency around the life cycle of pharmaceuticals, because transparency is fundamentally linked to good governance, if you want. It's linked to the ability of being able to design and develop and make good policy decisions. So I think it's important to continue talking and discussing about transparency, because it would eventually enable better policy decisions. This is clear. But let me take this opportunity just to start off saying how much I've been pleased by all the positive reactions that we received from many fronts on the adoption of the transparency resolution, starting right away from the chair of Committee A, Dr. Lutukuta, Angola's Minister of Health at that time, who stated that we were able to address one of the most complex and polarizing issues in global health. As I said, it wasn't really nothing new, but it was definitely an opportunity and a great opportunity to confront at technical level with different delegations, all working in different contexts all over the world, but sharing a common challenges. And then after that, also the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, expressed support for the adoption of the resolution. And then after that, all the reports that started to appear on the same day on major newspapers and magazines around the world, as well as medical journals. However, I must admit, the most touching comment was probably made to me by people that I didn't even know, while the meeting room was still, let's say, cheering for the adoption. Someone in particular told me, "Thanks for my children," which was really very touching. And in the same way, other delegates also defined and called the long and hard negotiating days a real diplomatic thriller in a way. So there were tensions, yes, but there was also very positive energy in the room, in the negotiating room, despite the very long hours. So let's also be aware that most delegates told me once it was over that nobody really believed we could make it at the end. Personally, I did not know what to expect at the beginning, but I did have one confidence. I was convinced that we could find a common ground. So find a common ground by applying common sense. This is what I kept repeating myself. And for example, many recognize the asymmetry of information in the whole value chain of pharmaceuticals. The main objective of the resolution was indeed to rebalance such asymmetry in order to ensure better and greater access to medicines. We had no intention whatsoever to disrupt the current system or the current framework around the life cycle of medicine or disrupt the market. To the contrary, actually. And I must be very clear, crystal clear on this point, because it's something that I keep repeating. I am fully convinced that we all need in global health a competitive, innovative, healthy and profitable industry. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to care for the patients who need treatment. The resolution was by no means a way to undermine these principles. And I recognize that some may potentially offer such interpretation, but truly this view was never shared, and it would be a false reading of the story. It is actually right because we need to work within the current framework or system that we need to also ensure that we make it work well and make it work in an efficient way. One example I could make, let's take clinical trials and clinical trial results. Under the current framework, we need to have full knowledge of the pros and cons of any medical product, the limitations and the benefits. So could we be expected to achieve this without having full data on clinical trial results? How could we assess the value of products without the full picture of their benefits and risks? This is what I mean when I say just applying common sense. And has it in this particular topic, clinical trials, it was very well pointed out even previously by WHO, when saying that in the case of clinical trials, full transparency on results actually advances both scientific understanding and timelines for product development, and ultimately enables access to essential medicines. Another examples I could make is related to patent landscape. As you all know, there is no single patent applying to medicinal products. Most are covered by dozens of different patents, all interlinked to the extent that you would need a super expert to understand when a product would be free from patent protection. So how could public health best serve patient interests without having a clear picture on the patent landscape for each product? This is what we need. This is what is also when I'm referring to common sense. There is no intention, no attempts at undermining the IP system as such, but to make it work well and efficiently. So finally, the issues of prices. Can anyone really argue that you must keep prices confidential in order to improve competition? Of all the delegations present during the tough negotiations, none was able to even make the slightest possible argument to support this concept. And this was also just common sense. So this is the way we proceeded, step by step, line by line, over the text of the resolution, offering only really pragmatic, real-world factual examples, never attempting at undermining those principles that we need a competitive, innovative, healthy, and profitable industry. But side by side with the principles of public health, of being able to get the best health gains possible from scarce health resources and the best health outcome for each dollar spent.
Thank you so much. Dr. Huenda highlighted that one of the key questions that came up was the feasibility of actually collecting any of this data, of in fact implementing this resolution. And I was wondering if you would just share briefly with us what has been the experience in Italy of actually putting this international non-binding resolution into practice at the national level in a more binding form.
Yes, thank you for this question. This is, it brings me to what are the next steps for implementation? I mean, that's, in my view, what do we need now? That's really the question. So in my view, I think what we need is a really an open, but really open-minded discussion with the industry to identify a suitable and common way forward. With both sides, though, acknowledging the existing challenges faced by each side. So, but without prejudice, just brainstorming on possible solutions to make the global market work well, a market that is able to meet public health needs globally and leaving no one behind. In Italy, we have made some progress, and a decree has been not only drafted, but of course, after WHA last year, we started drafting and working a new decree that would define the procedures for the National Medicine Agency to follow when negotiating prices and subsidies, basically, for new pharmaceuticals. And this is something, those procedures were nearly 20 years old. So the last time that they were reviewed was a long time ago. So it was a great opportunity to be able to update those procedures and start using some of the elements that were included in the resolution. So we asked for, or included, the need to disclose any funding received, public funding received for R&D for that particular product. And we disclosed also the need, or included the need to disclose better information and clearer information regarding the patent status of the product. And then also included the need to specify price and volumes expected or actually achieved in other markets for the particular product. So this decree was then brought through the bureaucratic channels and was fully signed by the then Minister of Health and Minister of Finance as prescribed. And then it went through the different other steps, bureaucratic steps. And I understand that by December, all those procedural steps were completed. Then, again, it's difficult to give you a real update now, given the current crisis that affected all of us. But I'm sure that there will be an opportunity to bring it back to. Also because those procedures, as I said, for the national agency, needed to be updated. And so it's work that I'm sure will be resumed as soon as possible.
Thank you for providing us with that update. And I think it really highlights both the importance of, but also some of the challenges in translating the high-level political agreement that was achieved at the international level to the national level, where these resolutions can really begin to make a concrete impact. On that note, let me turn to our next speaker. Before I do, I just wanted to remind the audience that you are welcome to enter any comments or questions in the Q&A box, and that will turn to those towards the end of our webinar. So let me now introduce Madame Caroline Fiat. Thank you so much for joining us. She has been a member of Parliament, the French Parliament, since 2017 as part of the group La France Insoumise. She is the first nursing assistant to be elected to Parliament, and she focuses much of her legislative work on health issues. She previously worked in a care home for the elderly, known as EHPAD in French, and she recently returned to the front lines, in fact, to help to combat the coronavirus crisis in France. She was one of the co-authors of the amendment on transparency that was, in fact, adopted by the Parliament last year. So, Madame Fiat, let me turn to you and ask you first, why is transparency a concern? Why was it a concern last year and still today? And what were some of the steps that were taken in Parliament to actually implement the transparency resolution? Where are we today in May 2020 in terms of the current situation? Thank you so much. Over to you.
Dear attendees, it's with a great honor and emotion that I take part today to this site event to the World Health Assembly. I apologize in advance for my very bad English accent. I would like to warmly thank the organizer, in particular the Observatoire de la transparence dans les politiques du médicament and Pauline, who gave me the opportunity today to present the experience for my parliamentary group at the National Assembly in France and the transparency issue. We all agree in the analysis the spending for medicines threatens the sustainability of public health systems in countries like France and prevents the access to medicines in resource-limited countries. During the last Social Security budget bill at the National Assembly last year, I had the opportunity to propose several amendments on transparency. They were suggested to us by the Observatoire de la transparence dans les politiques du médicament and by several other NGOs Aide, SIDAction, Médecins du Monde. They were asking to include in the criteria to set the price of a medicine, the actual spending for research and for their production. These information are indeed critical in the negotiation process with pharmaceutical companies for the prices of medicines. How can we justify that we pay twice for medicines and health products? A first time through the funding of research and development, including through tax credit, a second time through the reimbursement by the public health system. How can we rationally negotiate with pharmaceutical companies without knowing prices in other countries, volumes, intermediary margins, public, non-public, and charity R&D spending, information regarding patents on the prices of available generic in other countries, and on the origin and price of active pharmaceutical ingredients? This is what we were asking for. As an example, for 10 years, the pharmaceutical company Sanofi has received 150 million euros for the French state through tax credit. During the same time, Sanofi has cut about 3,000 researchers' positions. Out of indecency, the company has been trying to patent molecules discovered thanks to public funding. Sanofi has, for example, tried to patent 2 molecules against tuberculosis known for decades, and these patents have been granted in high tuberculosis burden countries such as South Africa. That a company can obtain patent for a combination of 2 molecules that it did not discover, and that the interest and non-toxicity were shown thanks to public money, is a perfect illustration of how dysfunctional the patent system is. More generally, it is a common practice by pharmaceutical companies without discovering new molecules to try to extend the patent protection of some of them for new therapeutic uses. Multinational companies hold monopolies on some medicines that they want to spend at very high prices and that are reimbursed by the social security, leaving the public sector with the risks associated to research. The French tax credit on research is thus an important tax break. Risks associated to research are public, socialist, and the profit privatized. How can we explain to our citizens that 150 million euros at least are each year granted to Sanofi while researchers' positions are being cut, and while each year 1 billion euros of spending is removed to our public hospitals? If one of our amendments had not been invalidated by the Constitutional Council, the community in charge of negotiating prices of medicines with pharmaceutical companies would have had a better leverage to negotiate prices and prevent very large and not justified profit margin, for example, on Zolgensma or insulin treatment discovered a century ago, but still under patent by Sanofi. We are asking for these debates to publicly take place. Is it acceptable that health workers and patients are sacrificed for profits? In the first reading of the bill in October, the General Rapporteur Olivier Véran gave a negative option to our amendments. The reason he provided trade secret as often to justify opacity. Surprised in the second reading of the bill at the National Assembly in November, the rapporteur Olivier Véran agreed on co-writing with our political group an amendment obliging companies to disclose the public support they received for R&D. On November 25, in the second reading of the bill, our amendment was adopted, voted by members of parliament from all political groups. A few days later, the bill was adopted in the final reading. But we should not cry victory too fast. New unexpected development on December 20, the Constitutional Council censored our amendment under the justification that it was not linked to the articles of the bill still in discussion at the time of the second reading. How can you explain that such a bad reason was given to block such an important measure? Today, the government has stayed inactive while it could implement our amendments simply through a decree like in Italy. Olivier Véran, we co-signed my transparency amendment, has now become Minister of Health. I publicly questioned him as soon as he has been nominated for him to issue a decree. But until now, I have not had any answer. How is it possible that the government keeps doing nothing while France committed itself unreservedly as a World Health Assembly member state during the 72nd World Health Assembly to ensure transparency of the price of medicines and health products? The French government is not holding its commitments and is defending opacity. The arguments given against transparency are often the same. It would be too complicated. We would have to look at every single expense made to discover one molecule, we are being told. But if activists and civil society groups manage to find this information through their research, how can the government pretend that it is unable to track the destination of public money? Another amendment that we proposed, we asking that in case of a difficulty or a dead end in the dialogue with the drug company, and in case of lack of transparency in disclosing the public funding received for R&D, compulsory license to be automatically considered. This amendment was also rejected by the General Rapporteur and the government. Every year, the government set objective of cut in the spending on the health budget through the Social Security Budget Bill. Each year, this is people with disease, patients, and health workers who see their situation deteriorating. Through transparency on the setting of medicine prices, the government could have reduced some health expenses without deteriorating the quality of health care in our public hospitals. I did not do it, preferring to please pharmaceutical companies and their interests. France has been facing several times shortages of essential medicines, including curare, morphine, propofol, midazolam. Because of that, some medicines were even removed from palliative care unit protocols. Demand for some of them has increased of about 2,000%. The products that are in tensions and for which we have been facing shortage are basic medicines, small molecules produced for most in generic form. Multinational companies make less profits out of these medicines compared to other medicines under patent, and therefore these medicines are not produced in the quantities that we need because they are considered as less priority. The production of the active pharmaceutical ingredients has been stopped by many companies in France to maximize profit margins. It's time for public money spent for R&D be beneficial to patients. It's necessary to reaffirm the sanitary independence of our country. France is one of the first world powers, is a rich country with great researchers, experts, and health workers. It's therefore time to build as a way out of the SARS-CoV-19 crisis, a public unit of production of medicine. It would allow us to ensure our sanitary independence, the quality of our healthcare systems without having to deal with the issue of the profits on medicines and risks of shortages. It would also allow us to put in place an international cooperation with countries also needing these medicines, in particular global South countries, and why not the creation of a free global vaccine. This is why I am proud to announce you that on June 4th, I will, on behalf of my parliamentary group, La France Insoumise, defend in the hemicycle of the National Assembly allow proposal to create this unit of public production of medicine. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think it's been particularly helpful for our international audience to get a much more detailed understanding of how the debate has evolved in France, particularly within the Parliament. And it will be certainly fascinating to follow how the proposal is received, how your proposal is received in the weeks to come. And Parliament will continue to follow that closely. I hope we can come back to that in the Q&A. Let me now turn to our next speaker, who is Mustaqim Dagama. He is the counselor with the South African mission here in Geneva to the World Trade Organization and to the UN. He has played a central role in raising transparency as an issue to be debated by WTO members in the TRIPS Council, which is the governing body at the WTO looking at the intellectual property treaty. He was previously at South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry, where he led the Directorate on International Trade and Investment. Mr. Dagama, thank you so much for joining us. We just heard a few minutes ago about an approach in Italy to introduce the transparency resolution into national binding law through regulations adopted by potentially to be adopted by the Medicines Agency. We heard about a legislative effort in France. Would you tell us a bit about the experience in South Africa of using a different channel, namely the Competition Authority, to address this issue? And why is it that South Africa felt that the issue of transparency was something that would be relevant to raise not just in the health sector, not just at WHO, but in fact in the trade arena? Yes, over to you.
Thank you, Siri. Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. It's indeed a pleasure to participate in this particular panel. I think you raise fundamentally difficult questions, and I think all of us at a national level are struggling with how we implement these particular norms. And I just wanted to say the issues raised in the resolution are not new. I think they've been around for quite a long time. And so coming at it from a South African perspective, we've been dealing with many of these issues for the last 20, 25, 30 years. And certainly when it comes to transparency, there is an obligation on governments to take proactive steps to ensure that there is a regulatory system in place to certainly regulate the conduct of parties. Now, I would certainly agree with Luca that the idea of the resolution is not to put pharmaceutical companies and originators in the dock. No, it is essentially to ensure that the mechanisms that intersect work more optimally. Now, if we really think of the system of intellectual property and the monopoly rights which are granted to people who innovate, we certainly think that there is a social contract which is embedded in that system, and certainly the rights that are acquired through that system are protected in novel and innovative ways. And traditionally, as a lawyer and speaking from a legal perspective, innovators are certainly rewarded for the innovation, but it comes at a condition, and this condition is that access should be given to the public to these benefits in a way that is commensurate to the effort that's been put in. And so from that perspective, I think when we look at international access and public health, we certainly think that it is an international public good. And if we think of access to health and health technologies in this particular manner, it requires us to work in a concerted way, not only at an international level, but also at a national level. So coming to the issues that we faced at a national level, you can understand that South Africa is perhaps an example of a country with the greatest inequalities. So our Gini coefficiency rating is very unequal. And so we have people that do not have access to the most basic needs. And so from this perspective, the South African Constitution mandates the state to ensure that there is a legislative process to address these inequalities of the past. And so there is a Bill of Rights which certainly protects the rights that citizens have, including to access to health and medicines. And so from that perspective, we would have to go to the advent of democracy in South Africa in 1994. At this point in time, what do we find? Well, we find the pricing of medicine largely subject to market forces, and market forces to the extent that pharmaceutical companies could decide at what price they wanted to sell their products. And this inadvertently led to a situation that discriminated against customers that were least able to pay. So their ability to pay was very low. And so what you will then see is that the elasticity is such that you have to take what you get and try to pay for it. And so part of the objective of government was really to implement measures to ensure that reform took place. And part of this was that we put in place a national drug policy in 1996. And what this really did was to enable access to safe, affordable, and quality medicines. And certainly it would also lay the foundation for later revisions of legislation to reduce the prices and to improve access to pharmaceutical products. And so by 1997, we certainly had certain amendments to the Medicines and Related Substances Act, which essentially ensured that patent holders could not frustrate the importation of medicines into South Africa, and also the practice of giving rebates and bonuses and incentive schemes that was outlawed. And certainly the most important innovation was the generic substitution of products. And so given this, we also put in place a pricing committee, which would have oversight in correcting pricing distortions in the market by creating a so-called transparent pricing system. And this was really the start of what we call the single exit regulatory framework, which was implemented in 2004. And what does this framework do? Well, it essentially looks at prices at which manufacturers sell pharmaceuticals, and essentially regulates this on the basis of various factors. So really the single exit pricing mechanism is really to ensure price transparency and that manufacturers sell medicines at one price to all consumers. And so from that perspective, regardless of the size of the order, regardless of the consumption level or the customer profile, at least the manufacturer is bound into such a system. Now, we also have to understand at this time, the Mandela administration ran into quite a lot of resistance. And so we also know that the Pharmaceutical Manufacturer Association of South Africa, which is composed of domestic and international participants, international originators, brought a case against the president. And essentially, the consequence of this case was that it spurred a debate on the relationship between access to medicines and intellectual property rights on the one hand, and certainly the issue of public interest. And this all found articulation, as we now know, in the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health. So certainly the legislative framework was put in place to ensure that we could access and could regulate the pricing mechanisms. But there was a second phase to what government had done. And Suri, as you rightly point out, competition law has been an invaluable mechanism that we've used to ensure that excessive pricing does not occur. And so our Competition Act makes provision for this particular situation. Being efficient, I just wanted to focus on one specific case. In 2002, there was the case of Hazeltau and others versus GlaxoSmithKline and Boehringer Ingelheim. And this is really still today the landmark case in South Africa in respect of so-called excessive pricing. And the consequences of this case was really that these companies were found to have colluded and essentially charging excessive prices, but also creating barriers to access into the market. And this conduct was essentially condemned, and an agreement was reached with our competition authorities. But the long and the short of this is that these companies agreed to make available their patents to produce ARV treatments in South Africa, which at that point and even today is a critical component of our healthcare system. Now, what impact did this case have? Well, this case really had a fundamental impact on the pricing regimes that we saw in South Africa. A study conducted by our competition authorities indicated that the pricing data from the year 2000 to about 2015 had decreased by 11% per annum, and the estimated cost saving to the government was something in the region of $900 million US. And so this accrued directly to the state, to the fiscus, and could be used for alternate purposes. So during this time also, we started looking at what we call health market inquiries to see what the relationship between various role players in a particular market would be. And also at this time, we moved beyond focusing only on ARVs and communicable diseases, but also to look at non-communicable diseases. And today, what we see is that there are certain actions now that our authorities have taken against pharmaceutical companies, for instance, for excessive pricing, for cancer medicines, and so forth. And so from that perspective, Suri, I think South Africa has been very consistent in how it implements its policy, evidence-based policy, and I think a whole of government policy. A third step that we have now started to implement was to address the broader impediments in our IP system. I think Luca had mentioned this, and Linia as well, that part of the problem that we have in South Africa in respect of patents is that we have a depository system. We do not have an examination system. And so we have adopted an IP policy that seeks to move basically from a depository system to a substantive examination system. And this essentially will start to address the patent tickets, the secondary use. Certainly also what we found is that the relationship between the Department of Health and, for instance, our patent office needed to be shored up. And so from that perspective, we have now at least advocated for an integrated database between the patent office and the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, which previously was known as the MCC. And so also, we would also want to further operationalize the so-called TRIPS flexibilities into our law. Now, at this point in time, I just wanted to say 2 words about the South African approach in the WTO and especially the TRIPS Council. we had, sorry, yes?
Oh, just, I'm going to have to ask you to be very concise. Thank you.
Okay, so just very quickly, we in the TRIPS Council, we have an informal grouping which is loosely based on BRICS memberships, and we decided that we wanted to bring all the issues that were brought up in the high-level panel report on access to medicines into the TRIPS Council, and so for the last 3 years, we've been able to conduct a dedicated discussion on IP and public interest. And so it was in this context that we could bring in competition, that we could bring in transparency and remind members that there are flexibilities that they can use to try and address these particular issues. Suri, I'm going to leave it at that. I may want to say something about, you know, the COVID strategies going forward, but I'm mindful of time as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Digama, for that overview. And it really strikes me that a number of the important provisions that have allowed the government to realize savings and access affordable medicines were built into the legislative framework already 20, 25 years ago. And perhaps in the Q&A, we can come back to what the WHA transparency resolution brings to the ongoing discussions in South Africa. If you already have the legal framework in place, what is it that, what is the additional ask or the push that comes through the WHA resolution? But let me now turn to our final speaker, who is Dr. Paul Fellner. He is the founder and the CEO of Revision Therapeutics, a company that is developing low-price innovative medicines. He's the former head of intellectual property at Novartis here in Basel in Switzerland, where he led efforts to obtain, maintain, and enforce IP rights. He's a lawyer as well as a scientist by training. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Fellner. We heard earlier in Dr. Wenda's comments some of the debates that came up during the transparency resolution negotiations about what might be some of the impacts of increased transparency, including both intended as well as unintended impacts. What do you think the impacts will be on the pharmaceutical industry, whether we're talking about potentially increased transparency of the R&D process, clinical trial data, the regulatory review process, or pricing and marketing stages? And where do you think increased transparency could be either productive or counterproductive? Over to you.
Sorry, well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be invited to speak on this esteemed panel. I feel a little bit like the sheep in the wolf's den, to reverse the analogy. But I think it's important to start as a baseline that I personally, and I think most of my colleagues in the traditional pharmaceutical industry, share an ultimate goal of ensuring access to medicines. And so I've often been bemused or confused, I should say, by the difficulty we have in arriving at more consistent methodologies or approaches to encourage access, because at the end of the day, that is the greatest benefit to patients, to the healthcare system, to the companies that are inventing and manufacturing drugs, and to the healthcare providers who need treatments for their patients. With that in mind, I think to address some of the areas, there's basic research. And in basic research, there is a great deal of transparency. People publish results very early. Discoveries around mechanisms of action, fundamental biologies, new receptors that trigger reactions in different cell types. This type of work should be shared broadly. The academic ethos of publication is a really fundamental driver there. It's very much one that the basic research parts of the for-profit industry also actually believe in. And we in fact have some pretty robust mechanisms now based on principles of open innovation for sharing basic research. Now, the thing about basic research is it's not a drug. It's maybe not even the beginning of a lead to a drug. It's an invitation to experiment to find that. And so basic research should be funded, should be encouraged, and should be broadly shared. But we have to remember it's not a medicine. That is an arduous, long task that only a few organizations in the world are really capable of doing, and that's primarily the multinational pharmaceutical companies. there's a bit of a conflict, because these companies are organized and funded as for-profit entities. And that's a very important consideration. People put money in, they invested money with a certain expectation, and the companies need to deliver on that expectation. And you could try to change the rules of the game after the fact, after the investments are made with certain expectations, but that has a certain unfairness to it. And we'll come back to talking about how we could adapt that. There is an area, however, where I think the trade-offs make sense from a transparency perspective, and that is with respect to clinical development data, and I would even advance the actual regulatory filings. From my perspective, these things have a tremendous value. I think everybody's perspective, these have tremendous value. And if your positioning is maximizing competitive advantage, you're going to want to keep this quiet. You're going to want to maintain the trade secrets as long as possible. You're going to want to ensure that your competitors developing drugs for the same indication don't benefit from your discoveries, from what you learn in your clinical studies, from how you position your regulatory filings. However, from the patient perspective and the system perspective, and I would suggest the funder perspective, this is really nonsensical because it's causing delay. You're slowing the process of delivering therapies to patients by months or years, perhaps permanently, in the situation where a company decides to pursue a path not knowing that it's a failure because the first company down that path discovered it's a failure. They pursue this path, they fail, and they're out of money. A promising drug is lost to the world because a company expended its last resources in an effort that could have been avoided had there been more transparency on the clinical side and on the regulatory side that would allow follower companies to be educated. And this benefits everybody. Nobody doesn't benefit from transparency, or everybody benefits from transparency. The multinational corporations don't know everything. Even with the extensive and very talented groups of drug developers that they have, there is no way to know everything. There are other benefits to open innovation or transparency in clinical development as well. You actually can engage the world by opening up your clinical development plans. This has two immediate benefits, and people have experienced this. Lilly in particular had a program of open clinical innovation, and what they saw was, first, they got a lot of important input from different markets about their drug development. So again, very talented drug development organizations in these multinationals, but they tend to have a bias. Maybe it's a US bias or a European bias. They're not first-hand familiar with what's important in large Asian countries or South American countries or Eastern European countries. By open innovation allows input from these regions, which can enrich the development path and lead to a more robust development path that facilitates access around the world because you've addressed the concerns of these other markets. The second piece is, and maybe even more important, by engaging the community, you actually facilitate the recruitment of patients, because treating physicians know these drugs in development. They can actually help patients to the clinical trials. And a biggest impact from what an expert in this area discussed with me on the expense of the clinical development path is failure to recruit fast enough. So you have to keep trials open for longer and longer and longer. And that is just hugely expensive, which is, is a factor in the pricing of innovative medicines. So I think that on the basic research side, openness is a no-brainer. I would suggest, although I would suggest that if you can get the imperative to speed therapies for patients and reduce costs because you're avoiding dead ends, as well as speeding things up on the development side, transparency makes a lot of sense as long as it's shared. On the commercial side, we get to a much more difficult situation because I don't think the pharmaceutical industry alone is responsible for the lack of transparency. There is a great deal of incentive to the pharmaceutical industry to keep quiet about their actual prices by countries that are negotiating against each other for the best position, knowing full well, as has been pointed out earlier, that you know, even rich countries might demand the same price that South Africa is paying, or worse, that is being paid in sub-Saharan African countries or Asian countries that are in the low income bracket. I think the President of the United States might very well push for that, even though it's in a sense unfair and counterproductive from a global perspective. That said, I think there's a lot of opportunity for transparency on the external factors. I have to say, I could care less how much it cost to develop a drug. That's a very unpredictable variable. And here's the thing. The money that the pharmaceutical industry gets today doesn't repay the development costs of that drug. They use the calculations, but the fact it's being invested in the next phase of research and development. So you have to think about, as you're adjusting these prices or controlling the prices, are you incentivizing and facilitating the next phase of research and development? And when you add that factor in on top of what did it really cost to develop this drug, which is oftentimes very difficult to tell, you get a really complex problem that's maybe not worth solving. Why? Because I think as last speaker, I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names, talked about, the South African government is doing a great job, and governments, payers can do a great job. And it's stunning to me that payers are acting as if they can't have no control. In my experience, the people with the money always have a lot of control. Now, I know that it's important that there's a imperative to get drugs to patients, but if you have the money, you can have a lot of influence over what that's going to cost and how that's going to work. And I think for a long time, payers sort of abdicated that responsibility. Certainly, I would say in the United States they did, and then didn't care at all what it would cost. But there are some other factors driving that, and that is that the pharmaceutical companies have protectors in the government. And so the governments are not necessarily doing their job. Even though they're the payers on one side, they're preventing the negotiation of pricing. And again, for me as an American, and this is a very personal perspective, I find it appalling that the largest purchaser of pharmaceuticals in our country, the CMS, is not allowed to negotiate drug prices. This does not seem like a market solution to me. This seems like corrupt capitalism, and it makes no sense at all. Let me just conclude by saying that I believe, and this is the reason for the founding of Revision Therapeutics, that the answer to transparency problems isn't trying to force more transparency and understand what all this information means. It's to create stronger competitive situations. There are elements of transparency. Again, what does the product cost? How can you price it effectively? Well, let me tell you, if you incentivize repurposing medicines, you actually have a faster to develop base, the potential for lower pricing. You can't price it at a low cost generic, but you don't have to price it as a new molecular entity. But all the incentives are to develop that new molecular entity and charge a super high price. And I must say, I heard some things here that tell me the idea of incentivizing new medical uses or repurposing are suppressed, because if you can't get some sort of exclusivity around that, nobody will invest in it. It's a huge missed opportunity. But to come back to the fundamental principle, to increase transparency, fund alternatives. I like the idea of France talking about funding an alternative for vaccine production. The people with the money have a lot of choice in how they use it. And if they wanted to use it to support alternatives, competitive alternatives to the existing regime, they absolutely could. And at the end of the day, the payers, that's where all the money ends up. But you have to be willing to invest it up front. You have to be willing to take the risk of failure, because that's a big part of pharmaceutical development. There are models where people are doing this on the generic side. Civica RX in the US was created to provide generic drugs. But here's another thing. When we talked about shortages, that's because price is driven so low, companies can't afford to stockpile. And the purchasers aren't stockpiling either. So if you're going to drive for the lowest possible price, you're going to do that at the expense of stock and supply chain and stock reservoirs. You're also going to do that at the expense of quality. So there has to be some greater interest in spreading the risk, sharing the cost, and doing it in a transparent fashion, all of which would lead to the opportunity for more competitive pricing, for faster development paths. And I'd say the most critical thing, maximizing access so that as many patients as possible are able to receive the benefits of these treatments as we all ultimately would like to see. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It sounds like there's actually some interesting points of agreement, for example, between yourself and what Madame Fiat was talking about earlier in terms of the government or payers having quite a lot of control because they control the money at the end of the day. It's the governments that are paying. I'd like to pick up on one of the themes that you raised and address this question regarding impacts on differential pricing to Dr. Huenda. This also has come up in the Q&A. I'm going to turn now to the Q&A. I'll ask you to please I'll try to keep the answers quick and to please keep the responses quick. But Dr. Huenda, let me turn back to you because this concern has come up a few times over the last hour and in at least one or two of the questions. What is it that you think might happen, is happening in terms of price transparency and the extent to which that could affect the affordability of prices, for example, in some of the poorest countries in the world?
Sorry, yeah, could you just repeat the question again, the last part?
Oh, yes. Sorry, just I wanted to come back to this issue of differential pricing because this is something that Dr. Fjellner also raised. Is there a real risk, in your view, that price transparency would actually make medicines unaffordable in some of the poorest countries in the world?
Well, you know, when we were having these negotiations, I think it was certainly a concern amongst some of the member states that could happen. But they were very practical ways that one could deal with that. I mean, the industry already applies differential pricing when it's, you know, providing products to different countries. And I mean, there is a likelihood that you could have the UK demanding to pay the same price as maybe South Sudan pays or Bangladesh. But I don't know how likely that is personally, but even if the likelihood was very high, I think one could think of ways around that. For example, you could publish guidelines on how transparency would deal with the issue of differential pricing, how it would be, you know, how differential pricing would have to be implemented in the context of implementing pricing transparency measures within national legislation. And so I think that would definitely address that challenge by, you know, for example, making it, you know, to forbid, you know, countries at a certain income level. The guidelines would articulate this, that if you're a certain income level, you cannot reference countries that are, you know, beneath your income group. So that would be one way. And I don't think it's a serious concern. I mean, it's a serious challenge that cannot be dealt with.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Lebasi, you wanted to comment on this? Please go ahead. Luca, we don't hear you yet.
Thank you. No, just
Okay.
because this came up during the negotiation, so there was a lot of discussion around this point. But we need to look at what evidence do we have available at the moment. And at the moment, for example, there is a price reporting mechanism used by the Global Fund, which actually I contributed setting up back in 2005, which allows for you know, the Global Fund, but anyone actually can log in the Global Fund website and look at the prices being paid for ARVs by all Global Fund grantees all over the world, and especially in low and middle income countries. But this has not affected the price being paid in developed countries. So it's actually not a good argument to say that it will end up affecting the prices paid by low and middle income countries. Actually, given the lack of price transparency, we have very little information about what is being paid by different countries for the same product, except for this example regarding ARVs. For example, the small evidence we have available relates, for example, to some vaccines, and based on those examples, we've seen, for example, that between France, Morocco, and Tunisia, the one getting the best deal for the same vaccine was France. So actually, if anything, what is actually occurring now is quite concerning, because it might actually show that for certain products, developed countries are the ones getting the best deal.
So, Luca, while I have you, there were a couple questions that came up. I'm going to ask you and also Madame Fiat to respond to, which was regarding the European level. Have the moves in Italy and France, for example, led to a shift in debate, let's say in Brussels, across the EU? Do you see that initiatives such as the regional groupings of countries, the Benelux initiative, for example, does that make any difference in addressing some of the concerns that have been raised here? So Luca, first I'll turn back to you, and then Madame Fiat, perhaps you can comment afterwards.
Yes, thank you. Well, what we have seen in terms of progress at European level, that I can mention, beside obviously what has been happening in France and in Italy, is what we have seen, for example, and I've seen on the media reporting that the newly elected government in its official program in Spain actually explicitly referred to its intention to require greater transparency over medicine prices. We will see how this will be implemented, but at least officially it's on paper that Spain also wanted to move in this direction. Most recently, I've noticed also some activities in Belgium. The Belgian Parliament in February 2020, the Council of State gave positive advice on a bill that makes it possible to inspect contracts, confidential contracts between government and pharmaceutical companies about expensive new medicines. But that was February 2020 and was just a positive advice on a possible bill. And then the pandemic came around. So this will also to be seen how it will, or what type of progress we can see. Other examples that comes to mind is, for example, IQWiG, the Institute for Quality and Efficiency in Healthcare, Germany, the German HTA regulator, let's say, based on the fact, based on some research actually showing broad non-compliance with EU guidelines in terms of reporting of clinical trial results, the head of the German HTA body said publicly that university failing to publish clinical trial data, including unfavorable negative data, on time should lose their public funding. So this is also other movements that we have seen around. At the EU level, I think it was I was particularly pleased to see that at the Gastein meeting back in I don't remember now the date. I think it was October at the Gastein meeting in Austria. The then former the former Commissioner for Health, Andriukaitis, actually reported on the importance to achieve better transparency. I mean, the Health Forum in Gastein, Austria, was focusing on disruptive thinking, and Commissioner Andriukaitis called actually transparency a priority for the Commission. That was a Commission that was ending, so it would be seen. It will have to be seen whether this will be carried forward also by the new Commission. There are positive signs, but what Andriukaitis actually was reported saying is that we need transparency on public investments in R&D and pricing to ensure supply of affordable medicines. So these are positive developments, encouraging, but definitely still not some hard steps or evidence being implemented. It must be said, however, that the EU environment or the EU legislation already provides, for example, for an obligation to report on all clinical trials. It also provides there is an EU directive on transparency, also including the price of medicines to enable a more competitive EU market for medicine. So, I mean, the legislative frameworks are already there. And it's just a matter to find the political will and energy and push to actually implement this. And I think what you mentioned in terms of having sub-regional groups like Benelux, but also Valletta, trying to address some of those issues, at least by cooperating together in terms of assessing the value of products and negotiating the price, is also a step forward.
Thank you so much. I think that I have done a miserable job of keeping time. And because we've already reached the end of our time, what I'd like to propose is for each of our speakers to have a quick look at the Q&A. And I'd like to offer you the opportunity to make a quick closing comment. What are the conclusions that you draw from this discussion? And we'll start in backwards order. We'll start in backwards order, and we'll start with Dr. Fellner, and then go to Mr. de Gama. Sorry to have given you not a lot of advance notice about this, but let's start with you, Dr. Fellner, and just have some quick closing observations. We don't hear you.
Yeah, no, because I was using my thumb or something to unmute. It didn't work well. Yeah, thank you very much. Look, I think that that these incentives are all on balance best for everyone, because frankly, a healthy, robust healthcare system is in the interest of the pharmaceutical industry. And what I would suggest is that putting conditions up front in financing and insisting on transparency and openness, which I believe is increases the efficiency of that financing, is a good mechanism. In other words, lay the groundwork and the expectations and rules at the beginning of the process, and then people know what they're doing, rather than having it imposed post hoc, and then people are resistant and ultimately answerable to investors who didn't have those things. So insist on transparency up front, and you can get it.
My apologies. Thank you very much, Dr. Fellner. Let me turn to Mr. Kim de Gama.
Yes, thank you, Suri. I think just some parting thoughts here. The first is that, nothing that we've discussed today is new. History repeats itself. And certainly when we you know, when we look at how we deal with the issue of transparency and equitable access to health and health technologies, we have to understand that when we dealt with this in the context of HIV and AIDS, ARVs came to the market at very high prices. And it was not until 2004 that these prices came down. And it was only at that time that government effectively started to regulate the incentives. So I would agree with Paul that nothing prevents parties from understanding upfront what the conditions are, because really making decisions in situations of uncertainty requires the right amount of transparency. And so from that point of view, I think there is to be a discussion in terms of how we balance this incentive on the side of private actors and then certainly also government actors. And finally, I just want to say that any vaccine that, that would be developed out of the collaborations that we see currently benefits tremendously from public funding. And so this needs to be taken into account, and we should really see these as public goods that have a different dimension in order to ensure that we have equitability and access. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And that was certainly one of the messages we heard from a number of the heads of state at the Assembly earlier this week. Madame Fiat, over to you.
Thank you. I don't speak English, so I will speak French. On comprend que l'industrie pharmaceutique ne veut pas de la transparence du médicament parce qu'ils veulent continuer à gagner de l'argent et ça leur coûterait beaucoup trop cher. Et moi, ce qui me tient à cœur et ce qui tient à cœur à mon groupe parlementaire, c'est le pôle public du médicament, c'est que la recherche soit financée par l'État, que tout soit public pour que justement nous puissions toujours avoir la main sur ce qui est fait, ce que contiennent ces médicaments pour pouvoir, en cas de souci, pouvoir surveiller si besoin et pouvoir surtout surveiller les prix. Enfin, voilà, la grande importance de la transparence du médicament, d'où l'importance de la proposition de loi que nous allons déposer avec mon groupe parlementaire le 4 juin prochain au Parlement.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Fiat.
Maybe Turkey to translate very quickly. Caroline Fiat said that transparency, she understands that the multinational companies don't really like transparency, the idea. That's why public medicines and research on medicine should be carried by the public sector. And that's what our political group is fighting for and defending for at the French Parliament. And that's why that's what she will defend through this proposition of law on June 4th on the public production of medicine.
Thank you, Pauline. Let me turn to Dr. Libasi, then Dr. Huenda, before turning to my co-host Pauline for a few final words.
Yes, thank you, Suri.
Yes.
Just for me to re-emphasize and clarify that yes, we are not dealing with anything new here. For many, many years, these challenges have been faced by people who have been involved in access to pharmaceuticals. But it's always very good. I think the intent of the resolution last year is just to summarize where we are and make really a wake-up call because of the increasing and basically unsustainable pressure that new pharmaceuticals are putting into health systems everywhere, whether they are low income, middle income, or high income countries. I mean, no health system actually can afford to actually not spend each dollar in the best and most efficient way. And there are certain basic elements of the life cycle that require immediate attention in order to improve the way we meet the need of patients. So there is no, again, an important element of the resolution or purpose of the resolution was to actually be able to perform better in the current, given the current environment. And definitely also to improve the way we also make policy decisions, because if we need to develop the right incentives for innovation, we also need to have a better understanding of also what are the challenges and what are the costs around in the R&D life cycle. And I don't think at the moment we have sufficient information. So what is required is to have better information. And I think there is room to achieve that. At the end of the day, private investors have access to better information. And I think it would be absolutely fair also for public sectors and health systems who invest in the pharmaceutical markets every year, several $1 billion, to have fair access to information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wenda, over to you.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I think in conclusion, I would like to agree with some of the speakers who said that medical products are different and they should not be completely left to market forces. What we have seen, at least in the Africa region, is that information asymmetries really hurt people and they affect access quite significantly. We have been experiencing significant challenges amongst African countries, struggling to source COVID-19 products, to buy personal protective equipment, infection prevention and control products. And this is not to get donations. Countries have cash to buy those things, but we are simply not able to get those things. And this is a very clear example where lack of transparency is, really working against a certain group of countries because of, what is, the unprecedented demand that currently exists without adequate global manufacturing capacity. So it would be good for countries to find ways of working together to make sure that these systems, the global system, can work for all countries in the same way. It is a very complex issue. It is a polarizing issue. But I believe we can find solutions. The fact that we were able to negotiate this resolution, which was really, really tough, but ultimately all countries wanted the same thing. We all want medical products to benefit patients everywhere. Corporates want this, we want this. It is not a zero-sum game. And so we can find ways of solving this challenge. There is precedence that we can look to achieve those things. We've done it with HIV medications. There are things that were unthinkable when the HIV epidemic began that have now become the accepted norm. And I think that with a bit of creativity and recognizing that we want the same thing, there are real opportunities here for us to find good solutions using this resolution going forward. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Pauline?
Yes, maybe just one final comment. So on the idea that some drugs prices would be too low, that they would not interest pharmaceutical company to produce them, like for instance, the drug in shortages. I think, once again, this is a wrong argument, because we know by making some calculation of the cost of active pharmaceutical ingredients that actually these drugs produced by generic producers
at a very cheap price still allow these producers to make lots of profit margins out of them. So I think the question is if these profit margins are not high enough according to multinationals, which we can understand because multinational pharmaceutical industry wants to maximize profits, then I think it's one additional reason for these drugs to be produced by the public sector. Because as it was said by several speakers, drugs and health products are not products like any other. And we have seen in many areas of the health products that competition doesn't work. For instance, on the diagnostic area, there is such a high concentration of the market with 3 main producers in the world that there is no competition. So the competition is a myth. It doesn't work, and it doesn't allow people to have access to exactly what they need. So that's why I really believe that this transparency can help to regulate that and to see where the public sector can help to produce the medicines that we need, the medicines and the diagnostic that we need.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, both to Pauline and to all of our speakers. I think certainly a year ago when this negotiation was going on for the resolution, we could not have necessarily predicted where we would be today, but I think it's fair to say that the issue remains high on the agenda, particularly in relation to COVID-19 technologies, for which there is certainly quite a lot of public money going into the R&D process. But one of the conclusions I take away is that the more we can clarify expectations both on the public and the private side, the more likely we are to have some better outcomes when it comes to the drugs and vaccines that are currently being developed for the ongoing pandemic. With that, let me just stop and apologize for going over time, but really thanks first and foremost to our speakers for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us in this look back at where we are on transparency today. Let me thank our participants, many of you who have hung with us, the majority of you who have stayed on going into overtime. I want to thank OTMeds, and the co-organizer for this event, Pauline Landé, our 2 media partners, Health Policy Watch and médicament. All of the Global Health Center staff who are working on this public holiday, Meg Davis, Nina Bianchi, Sachio Yagi, Nora Sada, Marcel Vieira, Christina Petrova, and Daniela Rengli, who have all contributed to making this event possible. We have a couple more series of events in the rest of the WHA week, as you can see on your screen. We have an event tomorrow focusing on female health workers on the front lines. Are they masked heroines? Next Wednesday, we have an event focusing on the intersection between the push for universal health coverage and the health security agenda. All of the questions that we didn't get to today, we will share with our speakers and try to continue this discussion on social media. You see the hashtag, our Twitter name and our hashtag at the bottom of the screen. So with that, let me close today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in some of our future events. Bye-bye.